Thomas Jefferson, a name everyone knows. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the third president. He built Monticello, that amazing house on the hill. People think of him as a genius, a statesman, a great leader. And that's all true. But there's another side to his story, one that's a bit harder to grasp. It's about money. Or the lack of it, really. Did Thomas Jefferson die broke? It sounds crazy, right? A man like him? But it's not crazy. It's what happened. His life, especially his later years, was a constant struggle with debt. He spent decades trying to keep his head above water, and in the end, he couldn't. The idea of a founding father, one of the most brilliant minds of his time, facing financial ruin, it just doesn't fit the image. We picture him as this grand figure, above the common worries, but Jefferson was human. He had big dreams, he had expensive tastes, he lived in a world that rewarded land ownership but also kept many in a cycle of debt. His story isn't just about politics and philosophy. It's also about a man trying to manage a vast estate, a demanding lifestyle, and an endless stream of financial demands. And this struggle, this quiet personal battle, shaped his later years as much as any political fight. It makes you see him differently, it makes him more real. He wasn't some untouchable icon. He was a man with money problems, just like many people today, and his story tells us a lot about his time. It tells us about the economics of being a Virginia planter, it tells us about the cost of public service, and it tells us about the burden of debt. So let's look at how such a powerful and important man could end up losing everything. Let's see how the money ran out for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was not born poor. He inherited a good deal of wealth. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a successful planter and surveyor. When Peter died in 1757, young Thomas, just 14, became the master of his family's estate. This included thousands of acres of land in central Virginia. It also included about 30 enslaved people. This was the foundation of his wealth. This was his start in life. He had land, he had labor. He had a place in society. This was not a small inheritance. It was a significant fortune for the time. And it meant he could pursue an education. He could study law. He could think big thoughts. He didn't have to worry about how to eat. He had options. But wealth in colonial Virginia was complicated. It was mostly tied up in land and slaves. Cash money was always short. Planters lived on credit. They grew tobacco. They sent it to England. Merchants there would sell it. Then they would send back goods, often on credit. The system kept planters in debt to the merchants. It was a common pattern. Jefferson was born into this system. He understood it, and he benefited from it at first. His land was valuable. It gave him status. It allowed him to borrow money. Then came his marriage. In 1772, he married Martha Wales Skelton. This was a love match, but it was also a financial windfall for Jefferson. Martha inherited a massive estate from her father, John Wales. This inheritance doubled Jefferson's land holdings. It brought him another 135 enslaved people. It made him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, but it also came with a hidden burden. John Wales had died with huge debts. He owed money to British creditors, and Jefferson, as his son-in-law, became responsible for a big chunk of those debts. This was a critical moment. It set the stage for much of his future financial trouble. He got a lot of land and slaves, but he also got a mountain of debt that he spent the rest of his life trying to pay off. And then there was Monticello. This was Jefferson's dream. He started building it in 1769. It wasn't just a house, it was a grand vision. He designed it himself, he oversaw every detail. It was an architectural masterpiece, but it was also incredibly expensive. He built it, then rebuilt it. He added wings, he tore things down, he made it bigger, he made it more elaborate. He filled it with his own inventions, he filled it with books, he had one of the largest private libraries in America. Now, he collected fine art, he imported French wines, he loved gadgets and scientific instruments. He had a passion for elegant living. These things cost a lot of money. They required skilled laborers, expensive materials, and constant upkeep. Monticello was a money pit, but it was his money pit. It was his masterpiece. It was his home. It was his identity. He also owned several other plantations. He had to manage them all. Farming was hard work, and it was rarely as profitable as he hoped. Tobacco wore out the soil. Wheat was less profitable. He experimented with different crops. He tried new farming methods. He was an innovator. But his efforts didn't always translate into big profits. The day-to-day management of the plantations fell to overseers. Jefferson was often away. He was serving the country. This meant he wasn't there to watch every penny. He wasn't there to make sure the work was done efficiently. This distance made his financial problems worse. He depended on these plantations to generate income, but they rarely generated enough. His dream home, his grand vision, it became a financial anchor. It pulled him down. Jefferson's public service was long and distinguished. He served as a Virginia legislator. He was governor of Virginia. He was a diplomat in France. He was the first Secretary of State. He was vice president, and he was president for 2 terms. These were high offices. They came with honor, but they did not make him rich. In fact, they often drained his personal fortune. When he was governor of Virginia during the Revolution, the state was bankrupt. He often had to pay expenses out of his own pocket. There wasn't much money for anything. His time as minister to France from 1784 to 1789 was expensive. He lived in Paris, he entertained, he bought books, he bought art, he collected seeds and plants, and he sent back things for Monticello. His salary was modest for such a position. He borrowed money to maintain his lifestyle. He believed he needed to represent America well. This meant living elegantly, even if he couldn't fully afford it. He was always thinking about appearances. Then came his time as Secretary of State under George Washington. He was away from Monticello for long stretches. His plantations were left to overseers. They were often not good managers. His fields suffered, his enslaved laborers were not always used productively. The crops didn't bring in enough money. This was a recurring problem throughout his public life. He couldn't be a dedicated planter and a dedicated public servant at the same time. His public duties took him away from his private income source. As president, from 1801 to 1809, he again faced financial strain. The presidential salary was set. It was a good salary for the time, but it didn't cover all the costs of the presidency. Jefferson was famous for his hospitality. He hosted dinner parties almost every day. He invited congressmen, he invited foreign diplomats, he invited scientists, he served fine French wines, he served good food, he believed this was important for building relationships, he believed it was part of his job. But he paid for many of these expenses himself. He didn't have an entertainment budget like presidents do today. He dipped into his own funds, he often sold crops like wheat or tobacco just to cover these daily expenses. He was selling off his farm's produce to feed his guests, and during his presidency, he enacted the Embargo Act of 1807. This was meant to stop American ships from trading with foreign countries. It was a response to harassment by Britain and France. It was a bold move, but it hurt American farmers and merchants badly. It meant Jefferson and other planters couldn't sell their crops overseas. The prices for agricultural goods plummeted. He was trying to hurt the Europeans. But he ended up hurting his own financial bottom line. This was a real blow. He saw his income shrink. He still had the same expenses. The debt kept growing. He was also generous to a fault. He often lent money to friends and family. He guaranteed loans for others. This was a common practice among gentlemen of the time. But it was incredibly risky. If the person he guaranteed couldn't pay, Jefferson was on the hook. And this happened more than once. These guarantees came back to haunt him. They added to his already growing pile of debt. He was a kind man. He wanted to help people. But his kindness often cost him dearly. He put his own financial stability at risk for others. His public life, while glorious, was a slow drain on his private purse. He served his country, but his country didn't make him rich. It made him poorer. When Thomas Jefferson left the presidency in 1809, he went back to Monticello. He was 66 years old. He expected to live out his days in peace. He wanted to focus on his studies. He wanted to tend his gardens. He wanted to manage his plantations. He was often called the Sage of Monticello. People came from everywhere to visit him. They wanted to hear his wisdom. They wanted to see his famous house. This stream of visitors was constant, and it became another huge financial burden. Jefferson was a very hospitable man. He loved having guests. He thought it was his duty. But these guests stayed for days, sometimes weeks. They brought their servants. They brought their horses. They ate his food. They drank his wine. They needed beds. They needed care. He hosted dozens of people almost constantly. He estimated that his hospitality cost him about $10,000 a year. This was a vast sum of money back then. It would be millions today. And he was paying for it all himself. He was essentially running a free hotel for famous people and curious visitors. His daughter, Martha, complained about it. She said the house was like a public inn. But Jefferson refused to change. He believed it was his place in society. He believed it was expected. His pride, in a way, contributed to his ruin. Monticello itself continued to be a money pit. The house was enormous. It needed constant repairs. It needed a huge staff of enslaved laborers to keep it running. There were cooks, house servants, gardeners, stable hands, craftsmen. All of them needed to be housed and fed. The grounds were extensive. The gardens were elaborate. Maintaining such a grand estate was incredibly expensive. It wasn't just the initial building cost, it was the never-ending maintenance. His agricultural efforts continued. But they never quite paid off. He grew wheat, he grew corn, he tried new methods. He tried to improve his yields. But the land was not always productive, the weather was not always cooperative. And market prices for crops fluctuated wildly. He was deeply affected by economic downturns. The Depression of 1819 hit him hard. Prices for agricultural goods collapsed. His income dropped dramatically. He had less money coming in, but his expenses stayed the same, or they went up. This just made his debt worse. He borrowed money from banks, he borrowed from friends, he kept a running account with various merchants. He was always juggling his debts. He would take out a new loan to pay off an old one. This is a classic debt spiral. He wrote many letters to his financial agents. He was constantly asking for extensions. He was asking for more credit, he was hoping for a good harvest, he was hoping for better market prices. But hope wasn't enough. Then came the big blow. In 1818, he co-signed a bond for his friend Wilson Carey Nicholas. Nicholas was Martha's brother-in-law. He was also a wealthy Virginia planter, but he made bad investments. He fell into debt, and because Jefferson had co-signed, he became legally responsible for Nicholas's massive debt. When Nicholas died in 1820, Jefferson was on the hook for $20,000. This was an enormous sum. It was truly ruinous. It was more money than he could possibly come up with. This debt, combined with all his other debts, sealed his fate. He knew he was in deep trouble. He wrote that this debt was like a millstone around my neck. He saw no way out. He had put his trust in a friend, and that trust had destroyed him financially. By the early 1820s, Thomas Jefferson's financial situation was critical. His debts were enormous. He owed over $100,000. In today's money, that would be several millions. He had no real way to pay it back. He owned vast tracts of land, but the land market was bad. He couldn't sell it for enough. And much of his land was entangled in trusts or other agreements. It wasn't easy to just sell it off. He tried to liquidate assets. In 1815, he sold his personal library to the U.S. Congress. The Library of Congress had been burned by the British in the War of 1812. Jefferson offered his collection of over 6,000 books. It was one of the finest libraries in the world. He got $23,950 for it. This was a lot of money. It helped him pay off some immediate debts, but it was a temporary fix. It was a band-aid on a gaping wound. And it was a huge personal sacrifice. He loved his books more than almost anything. Selling them showed how desperate he was. He later started building a new, smaller library. He couldn't help himself. He loved to learn. He loved to read. His hospitality continued. People still came to Monticello. They still stayed for days. The expenses mounted. His health began to fail. He was getting old. He couldn't oversee his plantations as closely. He relied on his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, for management. But even good management couldn't fix the underlying problems. The economy was still weak. Crop prices were low. The debt was compounding. Interest was piling up. He wrote letters of distress to friends. He explained his situation. He was embarrassed. He felt like a failure in this regard. He, the man who drafted the Declaration of Independence, was facing financial ruin. It was a deep personal humiliation. He feared that his family, especially his beloved daughter Martha, would be left penniless. He worried about his grandchildren. He wanted to provide for them, but he had nothing left to give. In 1826, just months before his death, Jefferson came up with a final, desperate plan. He proposed a lottery. He wanted to sell off a large portion of his land, including some of his prime properties, through a public lottery. He hoped to raise enough money to pay off his debts. He planned to sell 10,000 acres of land. He sought special permission from the Virginia legislature. It was a controversial idea. Many people found it undignified for such a great man, but Jefferson saw no other choice. He believed it was the only way to save his estate and provide for his family. He wrote, "I have made a lottery of my property in order to pay my debts." He was open about it. He was honest about his desperation. The lottery proposal gained some support. Some people recognized his contributions to the country. They wanted to help him, but it was slow to get started. Tickets didn't sell quickly enough, and before the lottery could fully take place, time ran out. Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826. He died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, his old friend and rival, died on the same day. It was a dramatic coincidence. But it didn't solve Jefferson's money problems. His death made his financial situation very clear. Thomas Jefferson died a deeply indebted man. His estate was insolvent. This means he owed more money than he owed. The lottery, his last desperate attempt, had not fully happened. It could not save him. So, after his death, his executors had to sell off his remaining assets. This was the only way to satisfy his creditors. It was a sad end for a man who had given so much to his country. The sale of his property began in January 1827. Monticello was eventually sold. His beloved home, the house he designed and built, the place he had spent decades perfecting, it had to go. It was bought by James Barclay, a local apothecary, for a fraction of its true value. The sale also included hundreds of enslaved people. Jefferson had owned slaves his entire life. He wrote about freedom and liberty, but he also depended on slave labor for his wealth. This is one of the great contradictions of his life, and upon his death, his enslaved people were sold. They were sold individually. Families were broken apart. This was a terrible outcome for them, and it was a stark testament to Jefferson's financial failure. His legacy as a slave owner is complicated. His financial struggles show the brutal economic reality of the time. He couldn't free his slaves in his will because he needed to sell them to pay his debts. He hoped to do so, but his financial situation made it impossible. His personal belongings were also sold. His furniture, his artwork, his farm tools, everything was auctioned off. It was a public humiliation for his family. His daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, was left with nothing. She had spent her life managing Monticello for her father. She had sacrificed her own family life for him, and now she faced poverty. She had to rely on donations from friends and public appeals to survive. This was a truly tragic outcome for her. Her father, the great man, had left her with no financial security. So, why did it all happen? Why did Thomas Jefferson die broke? There were several reasons. First, his lifestyle. He lived grandly. Monticello was expensive to build and maintain. His hospitality was ruinous. He refused to live within his means. He had expensive tastes in books, wine, and art. Second, the nature of wealth in his era. His wealth was tied up in land and slaves. Cash was always short. He was part of a system that encouraged debt. Third, his public service. While honorable, it took him away from his plantations. It meant he couldn't manage his finances properly, and his salary often didn't cover his expenses. Fourth, economic downturns. Agricultural prices were volatile. The Embargo Act hurt him. The Depression of 1819 hurt him more. Fifth, bad luck and poor judgment. He co-signed for his friend Wilson Carey Nicholas. This huge debt was the final nail in his financial coffin. It was a massive sum he could never repay. He was a brilliant man, but he was not a brilliant businessman. In the end, the answer is clear. Yes, Thomas Jefferson did die broke. His finances were in ruins. His estate was insolvent. His family was left to struggle. His property, including his beloved Monticello and his enslaved people, was sold off to pay his debts. It was a slow, painful slide into financial ruin. It lasted for decades. He spent his retirement years consumed by money worries. He tried everything he could think of, but he couldn't escape the cycle of debt. His story reminds us that even the greatest among us can face profound personal struggles. It shows the human side of a historical giant, and it tells us that a life dedicated to public service, while noble, can come at a very steep personal cost.